We're going to hold off for a few minutes. Mr. Shabbat's is on his way, and then we'll start. The subcommittee will come to order. Members present will be permitted to submit written statements to include in the official hearing record. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous material for the record subject to length limitation in the rules. Well, good morning. The subcommittee assembles today to discharge our responsibility to conduct oversight of the administration's fiscal year 2018 budget request for South Asia. Today, we will discuss requests for Bangladesh, India, the Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, reserving Afghanistan and Pakistan until next week, when we'll convene jointly with the Subcommittee on the Middle East and North Africa. It goes without saying that South Asia is an increasingly consequential part of the globe. For a long time, the world's center of gravity has been shifting to the east, and the Indian Ocean region is a major part of this trend. The 5 nations we'll discuss today, Bangladesh, India, the Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, have about 1.5 billion residents combined, comprising nearly 20% of the world's population. These nations are located along or on top of vital global sea lanes through the Indian Ocean, which grows more strategically important by the day. Connecting vital straits and rising Asian economies in the east with the rest of the world and its energy to the west, the Indian Ocean has significant implications for security and trade across the globe. Despite the immense strategic economic importance of these nations, this year's State and Foreign Operations Congressional Budget justification shows the administration intends to slash our commitments to them by 48%. Under the administration's request, this region is the hardest hit by cuts after Europe and Eurasia. As I stated during the subcommittee's last budgetary oversight hearing, I commend administration's efforts to increase fiscal responsibility, but I'm concerned that cutting the budget to an arbitrary dollar amount has been prioritized over the actual value of the individual programs. It's worth reiterating that even before this year's foreign operations budget was slashed by 30%, it accounted for just 1% of annual federal outlays. Dramatic cuts to foreign aid are not the way to rein in our out-of-control government spending, especially if they undermine U.S. interests. Sound business logic dictates that we should continue projects that deliver a good return on investment, but this year's request seems to defund a number of initiatives that significantly benefit our national interests. In Sri Lanka, for example, U.S. foreign assistance will be cut by 92%, mostly from accounts that have supported programs to promote the rule of law, democratic reforms, post-Civil War reconciliation, and related efforts. These programs are cost-effective ways to contribute to Sri Lanka's transformation while pursuing a partnership in strategically critical locations. Even at their height in 2016, U.S. assistance commitments to Sri Lanka were about $42.5 million, and that's a bit less than half the cost of a single F-35 fighter jet. That seems like a reasonable investment to gain a friend in one of the world's most critical sea lanes. While we're forming a large Millennial Challenge Corporation compact with Sri Lanka, the MCC will focus on economic activities. I'm concerned that by changing course so drastically, We want to make sure that we're not throwing away the investments we've already made in Sri Lanka, leaving a gap in the democracy and governance programs Sri Lanka badly needs and potentially forcing the closure of our U.S. aid mission. Requests for other nations in this region raise similar questions. Assistance of the Maldives, which faces serious security risks, will be cut by 87%. Assistance to India and Nepal will each be cut by about 60%. Amid the rising strategic and economic importance of the Indian Ocean region, these numbers raise the serious risk of sending the wrong message about our understanding of the region and our commitment to stay engaged. As in any business, it is important to look at whether investments our competitors are making. As we reduce our commitments in South Asia, China is expanding there like never before, leveraging huge infrastructure projects to rapidly becoming the preferred partner in locations across the Indian Ocean. We have all heard the cliche that nature abhors a vacuum. This morning, as we discuss the fiscal year 2018 budget request for these 5 nations, I'm interested in hearing from the witnesses how the reductions of our commitments will affect U.S. security and economic interests in the Indian Ocean and how our partnerships will fare. I also hope our conversation will answer a comparatively simpler question. Does this budget represent a step forward in our partnership in South Asia? Without objections, the witness's written statement will be entered into the hearing, and I now turn to the ranking member for any remarks he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had this brilliant opening statement to talk about the budget cuts. You, unfortunately, already laid it out on a level of eloquence that I would not try to match.
Write your notes before you got here.
And I want to associate with you. I want to associate myself with your comments that this is not the time to be cutting our foreign operations, particularly in the South Asia area. My district includes most of the studios. I love actors. We have before us an acting assistant secretary and an acting assistant administrator. But on this one occasion, I'd prefer not to be talking to actors. The idea that this is the fault of the Senate and the confirmation process, I am always in favor of blaming the United States Senate. Done it in this room many times. But the folks have not been nominated yet. The Senate is controlled by Republicans, and they've changed their rules so it takes only 50 votes, only Republican votes to confirm. This is not a confirmation problem. This is an appointment problem. Secretary of State and I have talked about this. He says, but the acting people are doing well, doing spectacularly well, to which my response has been, fine. Ambassador Wells should be given the job permanently, and I don't have a response. I didn't signal you out, actually. But in general, the people he praises ought to be given the job on a permanent basis. The idea that we go from Obama appointees to acting and then to other appointees, perhaps all in 1 year, but puts our foreign policy in disarray. With regard to reaching out to the people of South Asia, I think it's critically important that we look at broadcasting. I will be asking just how involved you are, Ambassador Wells, in talking to the folks that control our international broadcasting. I think they try to match our foreign policy objectives in selecting which countries to broadcast to and in which languages, but I think they often don't get much guidance from the State Department. But what's worse is this committee has urged them to start broadcasting in the Sindhi language and other languages of Pakistan, starting with Sindhi, and they've always found a reason not to do so, even though the cost would be, I think, less than a cost to operate an aircraft carrier for a minute and a half. So I think we'll learn from your testimony just how problematic the situation in Pakistan is. You're dealing with a nuclear state that is not always consistently friendly with the United States, and not only, and apparently even in its military city of Abbottabad can't find a compound inhabited by Osama bin Laden, and yet we're only reaching out in Urdu, the language the government might prefer us to broadcast in, but not the language used by thousands and thousands of businesses who try to reach out to consumers. They know what they're doing when they try to sell soap. We should be in the same language. India, Afghanistan, the president, and I know from other sources, has doubled down on this idea of encouraging India to be involved in Afghanistan. India is a poor country. One questions whether it should have a foreign aid program at all. If it doesn't have a foreign aid program, it has immediate neighbors like Nepal and Bangladesh whose needs far exceed India's capacity to provide. And yet India is spending foreign aid money in Afghanistan. It is a geopolitical effort to deal with Pakistan, and one that we should not encourage. The Durand line between the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan has not been recognized by the Afghan government, and we ought to condition our aid to Afghanistan on the recognition of that line. I realize that's tough. They'll say, oh, don't, but the fact is, as long as Afghanistan leaves open the idea that they're claiming Pakistani territory, it's going to be very hard to get the Pakistanis involved, as we need them involved, in controlling the Afghan Taliban. And certainly Pakistan sees its enemy as India, and the idea that India would have a closey relationship with an Afghanistan that hasn't recognized a border and with whom they share the Pashtun ethnic group, it shows that this particular foreign aid program of India should not be on the top of our list when we talk to the Indians about how they can use their scarce resources to help the most desperately poor people in the world. So I look forward to talking about these issues and trade as the question begins.
I thank the ranking member, and I know you'll be excited that next week we'll have the hearing on Afghanistan and Pakistan with the full committee, and so we'll fulfill that. We are thankful to be joined today by the Honorable Alice G. Wells, Acting Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, and I appreciate your time yesterday with the briefing. And Ms. Gloria Steele, again, back talking to us, Acting Assistant Administrator for the Bureau for Asia and the U.S. Agency for International Development. And with that, we're going to let you go ahead and give your statement. You'll have 5 minutes red light. Turn your red light on so that the microphone's on. You'll have your timer there. And Ambassador Wells, if you would, your opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Yoho, Ranking Member Sherman, and Representative Brooks. Thank you for inviting me to testify on the fiscal year 2018 foreign assistance priorities for South Asia. And in my oral remarks today, I'll briefly summarize my written statement, which has been submitted for the record. It's an honor to appear before the subcommittee as both Acting Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asia and as Acting Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. The reintegration of the State Department's policy offices for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and South Asia is improving coordination and will enable us to more effectively advance U.S. national security interests across the region. Today, a quarter of the world's population, 1.7 billion people, live in South Asia. It's the fastest growing region in the world, with almost half the population under the age of 17. This drives economic growth, expected to be above 7% from 2018 onwards, along with unprecedented opportunities for trade. Nowhere are these opportunities greater than in the growing road, air, and sea links between India, Bangladesh, Burma, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, and the rapidly expanding ASEAN economies. 70% of the infrastructure required to sustain and support the India of 2030 has yet to be built. This will be an enormous opportunity for U.S. companies that have the technology and expertise. For example, Boeing alone foresees a market for 2,000 commercial aircraft in South Asia over 20 years. The region's growth has the potential to create 500 million new customers for U.S. businesses and consumer goods, financial services, technology, infrastructure, the health sector, energy, education, tourism, and more. In 2014, the United States exported more than $22 billion worth of goods to South Asia, making us the region's #1 trading partner. These exports support thousands of jobs, and as the region rises, thousands more are likely to be created as a result. India is one of our most important strategic partners and a country of growing political and economic importance globally, with which our values and national interests increasingly align. U.S. assistance to the Indian government contributes to meeting the basic needs of the Indian people, helping India to devote more attention to the regional and global leadership roles to which it aspires and which the United States supports. Bangladesh is a key partner for the United States. Despite its development and security challenges, Bangladesh sustains global peace with over 7,000 police and armed forces deployed to 10 UN peacekeeping operations. It contributes to global food security and can provide a moderate alternative voice to countering violent extremism. In recent weeks, Bangladesh has also demonstrated its continuing commitment to host large numbers of Rohingya refugees. U.S. assistance will continue to strengthen Bangladesh against the threats of radicalization, support Bangladesh as a global model in humanitarian development and poverty reduction, and promote a trade and investment environment conducive to U.S. companies. And in one of the poorest countries of the world, our assistance to Nepal helps strengthen democracy and improve transparency and accountability. With an MCC compact expected to be signed shortly, we will assist the Nepali government in transforming its energy and transportation sectors. Since Sri Lanka's historic January 2015 elections, the United States has been partnering to make its workers more skilled, citizens more empowered, while ensuring that the government continues its ambitious reform agenda. As Sri Lanka implements its reform objectives and in accordance with limits set by Congress, our modest military-to-military engagement has expanded slowly and incrementally. Our 2018 requests support security and maritime cooperation and enhance strategic trade controls. In the Maldives, we have real concerns about the status of rule of law and democracy. Maritime security is also a great concern due to threats posed by narcotics trafficking, piracy in the Indian Ocean, and seaborne trade in illicit materials of potential use for terrorist activity. Our foreign assistance request continues targeted support for maritime security cooperation. South Asia remains among the least economically integrated regions in the world, and non-tariff barriers are a major cause. Through regional programs, we'll target the elimination of non-tariff barriers and the facilitation of regional trade and investment. In conclusion, South Asia is at the crossroads of the Indo-Pacific region, whose sea lanes are critical to the security and prosperity of the United States. By promoting a common vision of economic growth, transparent development, accountability, and regional integration, the policies and programs supported by our fiscal year 2018 request will ensure that the United States continues to be a leader in advancing regional unity and stability. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to working with you and your staffs.
Thank you for your opening statement. Ambassador Wells, Ms. Steele.
Chairman Yoho, Ranking Member Sherman, Representative Brooks, Representative Connolly, thank you for inviting me to testify on the President's budget request for development assistance in South Asia. The President's budget request for USAID in South Asia region is approximately $190 million. This request supports activities in Bangladesh, Nepal, and India, 3 countries in vastly different stages of development. In Bangladesh, the country finds itself at an important crossroads in its democratic evolution and economic growth. USAID has a diverse program helping to address the underlying factors that impede the country's progress and stability. Much hinges on the success of Bangladesh's secular democracy in preventing violent extremist attacks. The budget request supports USAID's program to strengthen citizen participation and government accountability. We are intensifying efforts to address the threat of violent extremism and recently awarded a new flagship project that will work to prevent recruitment of members of vulnerable groups by confronting key drivers. Advancements in agriculture have helped to drive poverty reduction and inclusive economic growth in Bangladesh over the past decade. But to continue this progress, the country needs to shift to high-value agriculture. USAID is promoting crop diversification, market access, and modern farming practices to help farmers make this transition. We are also supporting improved disaster preparedness and natural resource management to sustain these gains and frequent natural disasters and competition for scarce resources. On health, the budget request supports our continued efforts to improve maternal and child health, mitigate the spread of tuberculosis, and prevent chronic malnutrition and undernutrition. In Nepal, more than 10 years following the end of its civil war, the government is hampered by constant leadership changes and unresolved drivers of conflict. These include limited inclusion of traditionally marginalized populations and weak governance to meet public demand for quality services. The 2015 earthquake was a significant setback for Nepal, pushing an additional 800,000 people into poverty. This budget request supports USAID's efforts to help fortify Nepal's fragile democracy, shore up its economic growth, and address persistent challenges in education, maternal and child health, and nutrition. So far this year, our support for the government of Nepal has been critical in holding 2 phases of credible, broadly participatory local elections, the first in 20 years. USAID assisted with 9 election-related bills, as well as voter education initiatives and political party candidate training for women and members of other traditionally marginalized groups. The elections mark a historic devolution of power and resources to the local level, giving the people a stronger voice. As we support Nepal's transition to a democratic state with functioning local governance, we continue to support the combined national and provincial assembly elections scheduled for November 26th and December 7th. With 80% of Nepalese engaged in subsistence agriculture, USAID is working to modernize farming methods in order to improve productivity and increase incomes. At the same time, we are working to catalyze economic growth through agricultural commercialization and increased agribusiness competitiveness. Our agricultural programs contributed to a 36% decrease in poverty in the targeted areas where we work in the past 3 years. In India, although significant development gains have been made, the country is still home to 1/4 of the world's extremely poor. Inequities abound, particularly in health. More than 40 million Indians, a population equal to that of California, are pushed into poverty each year because of healthcare costs and illness-induced low productivity. Moreover, India accounts for roughly 1/5 of global maternal and child deaths and 1/4 of the world's new TB cases. Given its population of 1.3 billion, India's capacity to effectively respond to its pressing health challenges has proved understandably challenging. With a focus on improving maternal and child health and preventing the spread of TB, the budget request enables us to demonstrate high-impact models and approaches that more efficiently and effectively direct India's own resources to save lives. For example, India now uses a cloud-based patient feedback system that USAID helped them to develop in order to ensure better accountability and governance of services in hospitals. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Sherman, committee members, thank you for your support. Investing in global development progress remains in our national interest. In supporting the world's most vulnerable populations and in helping to build more stable, open, and prosperous societies, we strengthen our own security and help to generate new economic partners. Our efforts are both from and for American people and reflect core American values of freedom, democracy, and stability. Thank you, and I look forward to your counsel and questions.
I have to commend both of you. You're right on time, under the marker. That's good. You know, I find this so important that we're talking about this today. You know, outside of India, which is the largest democracy, and us being the oldest democracy, I see the South Asia region being a fledgling democracy area. And when I look at Sri Lanka, going through the civil war that they had for 30-some years, now that we have a democracy in place, a fledgling one since, what, 2015? The investment that we have done, coming from the business world, what we knew is not to put good money after bad. And we wanted to make sure that the investment we made stays, and the long-term benefit of that is here in the long term, so that we can make sure there's rule of law and democracies that continue to foster those relationships in trade, economics, security, and cultural exchanges. And it's so important that we do that. And, you know, I know we're going through some fiscal challenges in our country. There will be austerity measures, as we've seen, but that doesn't mean you move away from the investments we've already made. We want to make those stronger. And so as we move from some of the maybe cuts from 96%, but we see MCC coming in there and investing, what is it, $500 million roughly in Sri Lanka, that we invest in the roads and the infrastructure, and we build an economic base for those countries to build upon. And it's so important that economic connectivity, that we build on that. And for Ambassador Wells, it's unclear that in the fiscal year 2018 budget, the amount of funds that are requested to further the Indo-Pacific Economic Corridor Initiative. Could you give us a breakdown of the amount of the funds that you think are necessary for this initiative to be successful?
Thank you. I just returned from Sri Lanka, where I had an opportunity to meet with the President, Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, and leadership, and we had very good conversations on Sri Lanka's need to continue along the road of reconciliation. What is a fragile post-conflict society, the important commitments that the government made with our assistance to the United Nations, and our determination to help Sri Lanka meet those commitments. And I heard firsthand from the Sri Lankan leadership that they understood that they needed to intensify, that they are now starting to operationalize mechanisms like the Office of Missing Persons. They undertook that constitutional reform was going to continue and move forward. And I think our role, our diplomatic role in ensuring that that reconciliation process continues is critical. And we are deeply engaged with the Sri Lankan leadership in that conversation and have been since the dramatic formation of the national unity government. In terms of the reductions in assistance, I mean, there has been, again, a rationalization of our assistance across the board. But what I would emphasize is that, ironically, in Sri Lanka, we're the largest grant provider of assistance. China's providing non-concessional loans that promote unsustainable debt burdens, which I think are increasingly now of concern to the Sri Lankan people and the government. But what we bring to our relationship are multiple tools. And so when I stand back and look at the totality of the relationship, how we have begun to engage incrementally on military-to-military engagement. We're going to have our first naval exercise in October. We've provided excess defense article equipment so that the Sri Lankans can perform more effectively as a maritime nation. We are starting an IMET program, moving from the enhanced IMET to a traditional professionalization courses IMET. And then you add to that our negotiation of a compact. We're actually close to, with congressional notification, a compact in Nepal. The Sri Lanka compact is in the process of being negotiated. We've allocated a little over $7 million this year to continue that process of defining what an MCC compact would look like, and we'd like to reach a compact by 2018. But that is the kind of assistance that we bring is, thought out, transparent, involves the public-private sector, has buy-in for civil society. The kind of investment that we make in Sri Lanka, I think, is deeply valued by both the government and the people. And when I met with civil society representatives, including the leader of the Tamil opposition, they very much want to see a U.S. role and welcome, our commitment to expanding, both the economic as well as the diplomatic portion of our relationship. So, I recognize that, that there's been a significant percentage reduction in the ESF, but I think outside of ESF, we are using our tools to reinforce a message of reform and to bring Sri Lanka into a space where they too will institutionalize the principles of the Indo-Pacific, freedom of navigation, transparency, non-militarization, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief at its core. And I think we're making good progress there.
And I appreciate you bringing that up because it's so important, because we see how China has invested it, and it is loans, and they get them to where they are unsustainable, and then they get into a situation where we saw the 99-year lease in Sri Lanka. And the investment that we want to do, we want them long-term, and it's to grow their economy, their economic base, the jobs for their youth. And you said half the population in South Asia is under the age of 17. And I found it astounding that you said 70% of the infrastructure needed by 2013 is yet to be built. I think with our business model, our relationships in investing in their country for their economic development is the way to go versus funding or loans as China does. And we see that all over the world, and it's important, the jobs that both of you do, all of our diplomatic corps as they represent the United States of America, to concentrate on that economic development, because if it's the economic development they have, they're going to guard it, they're going to protect it, and it's going to make our alliance stronger. So I commend you. I am out of time, and I know, Ms. Steele, you had something to say, but hopefully we can come back to you. And I'm going to turn to the ranking member. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Once again, you've shown brilliance by starting your questioning regarding Sri Lanka. I will imitate that brilliance. As I understand it, Ambassador, we're talking about a 92% decline in our aid to Sri Lanka. Does this request include any support for reconciliation and reform efforts in Sri Lanka? And what signal are we sending with a 92% reduction? Ambassador?
And I'll also turn to my colleague to discuss the specific USAID programs. But again, I recognize the severity of the percentage decline in ESF, but I would point to the totality of our programs. And on the reconciliation side, diplomatically, we have always been the leading partner in driving the original agreement at Geneva, which produced the government's historic
So we do a
commitment.
great job of talking, which is what diplomats and congressmen do. But in my world, money talks, and a 92% decline in money cannot be covered up by eloquence or good offices or even art of the deal negotiations. Ms. Steele, we're talking about $3.3 million. That's basically, I hesitate to ask you about the aid for Sri Lanka because it's basically been zeroed out. I'm sure Congress will not do that. But can you support reconciliation and reform with $3.3 million?
Mr. Sherman, we have invested $70 million since 2015, and we worked in reconciliation, economic growth, and good governance. And we have been using those resources, which continue to be still available, some of them, to build their capacity to continue to be able to do what we started out to do.
Thank you. I do want to go on to the next question. I'm sure, Ambassador Wells, you're well aware of the Rohingya. As additional background, America saved the people of Kosovo by bombing a Christian country. We saved the Muslims of Bosnia. And so my question is twofold. First, are we going to cajole or pressure Aung San Suu Kyi and the government of Burma, Myanmar, to start respecting these people's rights, to change their legal structure so that groups that have been there for 100 years and longer are given citizenship? And secondarily, what are we going to do so that Muslims around the world know that we saved the Muslims of Kosovo and Bosnia, and here we are playing a major role, or what I hope will be a major role, in saving those of Southwest Burma, excuse me.
Thank you. When I was in Bangladesh, it was at the onset of the refugee influx. At that time, it was about 20,000. It's now over 160,000, I believe. And the human tragedy is compelling. And what we have worked to do is both to assist Bangladesh in responding to the crisis. We're waiting.
Ambassador, the easy thing is to just throw money at refugees in Bangladesh.
In addition to
how tough are we going to be on the Burmese government?
In addition to the assistance we will provide are providing and will continue to provide to the Bangladesh government, the UN had Kofi Annan went out and did a report on the situation, which produced several recommendations, including recommendations like a joint commission on border management. And we are working to see how we can have both countries sit down and implement some of those recommendations. But I agree with you that this is a crisis, and there needs to be both a humanitarian and a political response to it.
But does Aung San Suu Kyi recognize her debt to those of us and millions of Americans who worked for democracy in her country and are now watching a government over which she has significant influence carry out these atrocities?
I'm afraid I'm not able to speak for my colleague, Acting Assistant Secretary Susan Thornton. But
okay.
So
your jurisdiction does not include.
It does not.
Okay, and if I can sneak in one more question, when a business asks for the help of the State Department and says it's important, do you look at how many jobs are involved in the project, or could you end up working just as hard because a big business is looking for a foreign supplier to be helped, looking to license IP, looking to do things that are very profitable for the company but involve very few jobs? Do you have a jobs analysis that guides you in determining how much effort to put into an economic request?
Our goal is always to support American business, and analyses are done of the individual proposals and their effect on creation for U.S. jobs. Companies have to petition to the U.S. Department of Commerce in order to receive advocacy, specific advocacy for that company, in which case they have to be the only American company competing to have specific
But if you have
recognition.
two projects, one in one industry, one in another industry, they're the only American companies, they both will produce $100 million worth of profit for the companies involved, but one will produce a lot of jobs and one's just IP licensing. What mechanism do you have to prioritize the jobs profits over the licensing profits?
We will advocate for all U.S. companies under that circumstance.
Okay. Now yield back.
Oh yeah, we'll probably do 3 rounds. The wisdom of Congress is that we book all of our meetings at the same time, and so people are on the judiciary, and you know how it goes. Anyways, let's move on. I'd like to talk about the Maldives. Being an island nation of 393,000 people roughly, it represents a growing terrorist threat. They're one of the largest sources of ISIS fighters per capita in the world operating abroad. Knowing that, what is the administration's reasoning for nearly eliminating the already modest U.S. assistance commitment to the Maldives? Ms. Steele?
We recognize that violent extremism is a very important issue in the Maldives, and we are in the process of putting together an assessment team to take a look at what we can do to help address the drivers of violent extremism in the Maldives at this time.
Okay. Ambassador Wells, do you have any comment on that?
We're also assessing how we can enhance our information sharing relationship with the Maldives in order to counter terrorism, counter violent extremism, while at the same time recognizing that the government, the president has consolidated control, has stripped the authority of many democratic institutions, and so there are complications and challenges in working with the government of the Maldives. Okay.
Let me ask you both, because we hear about the cuts for Sri Lanka, but we don't talk about the investment of MCC of $500 million roughly. Are the other countries, are we at a point where MCC is going into Bangladesh, the Maldives, Nepal? Have we looked at business models? Because the way we invest on those, we hold the countries accountable with the metrics that are set up in those, and it's more of an investment in the infrastructure and business. What are your thoughts on that? Say for the Maldives, have we looked at that?
The MCC has very rigorous standards and criteria for countries to be eligible for compacts. And so currently within the South Asia region, it is Nepal and Sri Lanka who are, Nepal is at the end stage of negotiating the compact, and Sri Lanka is at the beginning. And so the criteria will still need to be applied, so there's no movement at this stage to consider a compact for the Maldives.
Okay, and in your experience in the countries that have used the MCC business model, do you find that more effective than just foreign aid through USA, through some other form, versus just giving money out and doling it out like we've done in the past in other countries?
I think they're very complementary, and I'll turn to Gloria, but my personal experience is that the MCC and its ability to do public-private partnerships, to tap in the government and the business community and to implement gender-related components to it has been very useful in multiple compacts, but it doesn't substitute for all the other assistance work that we do. Gloria?
Yes. When I was in the Philippines, I was mission director in the Philippines before coming here, and we had an MCC compact there, as well as a robust Partnership for Growth program run by USAID. And they are complementary. They don't actually substitute for one another. We work on very specific issues that are of the time important to them. We did an analysis with them to identify what areas they wanted to work with, and they complement what MCC does, but MCC's analysis of the programs they do are put together 5 years before, because it's a 5-year compact. And so we focus on the constraints they face at the time. They're complementary, but they don't substitute for one another.
Okay, thank you. And then with President Trump's speech, I think it was a week or two ago, where he was talking about our pivot in with Afghanistan and Pakistan and India's more increasing role with Afghanistan. And we saw India's willingness to stand up to China in the Northern Territory. And then we saw the resolution of that peacefully, thank God. Are there provisions in the proposed budget that could help deepen the U.S.-India security partnership, which could be beneficial in checking China's unwarranted territorial claims through the rest of Asia? And then, Ambassador Wells, you brought up the mill-to-mill cooperation between the United States Navy with Sri Lanka. What are your thoughts on that, dealing with India, and how can we strengthen that relationship?
The United States supports peaceful and stable relations globally among all countries, including India and China. And our goal ultimately in the Indo-Pacific region is every nation should be able to work together to uphold international norms and to prosper. And while we strongly support, we obviously strongly support a prosperous India that plays a leading global role, both China and India are leading powers, but our relationship with India really stands on its own. And it stands on its own because it's based on democratic values, on close political and economic ties. And if you look at the military relationship between the United States and India, it's an extraordinary story over the last 10 years where we went from 0 in military sales to 15 billion. We're currently holding the largest military exercise with India and Japan, the Malabar exercise that brings together 10,000 personnel and our largest carriers. We are, with India as a major defense partner, we are able to now offer advanced technologies. And during the visit of Prime Minister Modi with President Trump in June, we had the unprecedented offer of the non-lethal Sea Guardian UAV for maritime security. We want to build on that military partnership. India, over the next 7 years, is projected to spend $30 billion in military modernization. Our companies, like Boeing and Lockheed, with the F-18s and the F-16s, are natural competitors and would deeply enhance our interoperability with India. But then how do we build that relationship further outward? So we're already working with Japan. There are opportunities to work with Australia. How do we, as democratic nations that share values, enshrine those values? And again, freedom of navigation, demilitarization, working together on disaster response, humanitarian assistance, setting a standard for the region. And I think when I was at this conference in Colombo, which brought the countries of the region, really from the Seychelles to Singapore together, I was impressed by the unity of purpose. People seek that, they want that, and we have an opportunity to create this working relationship.
Thank you. Mr. Sherman, round two.
I want to pick up where I was on prioritization of two different companies that would like your assistance. You don't have unlimited resources. So one possibility is that advocacy for a U.S. company consists of just sending a letter or rubber stamping a document, in which case you do have unlimited resources. You could send out 1,000 letters a year. But often, I would hope that you're doing more than that. If you have to prioritize between, do you have unlimited, I know you don't have unlimited resources. Are there significant resources being used to advocate for U.S. businesses? And given the fact that your resources are limited, how do you prioritize which companies to put a lot of effort behind?
In countries where you have a vibrant, trade relation and foreign direct investment relationship, then yes. The bigger deals where we are eligible and allowed under U.S. regulation to lobby specifically for a company, those projects that deliver more jobs for Americans are going to occupy.
How are you certain that you're, because we talked privately in my office, I brought to your attention the fact that an ambassador was advocating for German-built cars, not in your region, I might add. So how do you get a report as to, okay, I've got limited resources, I could put a little more time in this project or that project. Do you get any report as to how many U.S. jobs are involved?
When countries apply,
or is it just the size of the deal? Because they both could be $100 million deals, but one is $100 million of licensing, as one is $100 million of product. So they both, if you just say how big's the deal, they're the same size deal. But what do you do to prioritize jobs, to know how many jobs are behind the project?
No, I'm speaking now from my personal experience as a former ambassador to Jordan. And there, what you receive from the Commerce Department, and I would have to defer to my Commerce colleagues, you receive an analysis of what the deal is and an understanding of the extent.
I would urge you to insist for the Department of Commerce that jobs be the first line, not how many profits, now not how big is the deal, how many jobs. I want to go on to Sind. We've seen disappearances, both of those who advocate for the Sindhi-speaking community and those who advocate for the Mohajers. These two groups don't tend to get along, but it seems like their political activists are disappearing, and I look forward to working with you to make official inquiries of the Pakistani government of political activists who have just disappeared, including the brother of a friend of mine. I know that we have a website from the consulate in Karachi in the Sindhi language. We do some public diplomacy, which means the State Department has determined that reaching out in the Sindhi language makes sense. Have you communicated that over to the Broadcasting Board of Governors, saying, hey, we're reaching out to people in the Sindhi language, you should too? Or more importantly, what do I do to get you to do that?
You've just inspired me to reach out. But I would note that in countries like Sri Lanka, for instance, our embassy is doing programming in 7 languages, and it's 7 different markets. And we're often confronted in places like Pakistan and India, where there are multiple languages that have deep reach at the state level or even lower, where there is a need to target information. So I absolutely take your points.
I ask questions about Sri Lanka. It's very important. Pakistan has an undisclosed number of nuclear weapons and 3 or 4 major languages. And it's important that we reach out beyond just Urdu. State Department has done that, and my inspiring you will inspire the Board of Governors of the broadcasting operation to do the same. Let's see. You mentioned airplane exports to India, either in our private conversations or here. That may be our biggest single export to India. We're in competition with Europe. They have a Export Finance Authority. We have the Exim Bank. Without the Exim Bank, we're at a distinct disadvantage in selling planes to India. Have you found the Exim Bank to be helpful? Do you think that we'd have an even bigger trade deficit with India if we didn't have an Exim Bank?
I can't comment on what motivates individual companies. Over the course of my career, of course, I've appreciated the work of Exim in supporting U.S. exports, and particularly in the aircraft sector. But I would note that in our trade relationship with India, these exports are continuing regardless. And during the Prime Minister's visit in June, we had the announcement of a $23 billion plane sale. And planes, commercial aircraft, as well as military aircraft, are a key sector for exports in the future.
Well, I hope that the President will appoint people to the Board of Directors of Exim Bank, and that it will carry out its duties. Otherwise, you may be back here, assuming that Rex Tillerson takes my advice and makes you the Permanent Assistant Secretary. Do you have a plan to reach balanced trade with the major countries in our area? Because if I share one thing with the President, it is a real focus on the trade deficit numbers, because those numbers translate into real jobs, real lives, lives that can be ruined, lives that I've seen being ruined. We have this trade deficit. You're doing a few things about it, but do you have a goal? Do you have a strategy designed to achieve a particular goal? And is a balanced trade relationship the goal?
That's a clear priority for the Trump administration, absolutely. And during the visit of Prime Minister Modi with President Trump, this was discussed. And I think
was it discussed in the nature not of, well, we'd like to sell more to India? Was it discussed in the idea we want to achieve balance in the trade? Because when I first got to Congress, administration official said, yes, if we could expand exports by $1 billion and expand imports by $2 billion, that would be great because we'd have $3 billion more in trade. And so is the goal is there a strategic goal to reach balance with India and with Bangladesh?
The administration is doing an assessment of the top countries with trade deficits, and the goal is to equalize and reduce those trade deficits. And in the case of India, there are obvious areas where we can work to improve IPR protection, to reduce non-tariff barriers. We have several high-level serious dialogues through USTR and the Department of Commerce to tackle specific sectoral issues. We've used the WTO in the case of our chicken, our poultry and egg exports, where we expect India to implement the WTO ruling. And this is a major part of our dialogue.
I'm going to interrupt for one more question because I promised you I'd ask this. Is India going to change its liability laws to put American nuclear plant builders on the same liability footing as those entities that have sovereign immunity, such as those from China, France, and Russia?
India took 3 actions. They joined the Convention on Supplementary Compensation for Nuclear Damage. It's a multilateral treaty.
Did they sign the additional protocol?
The additional protocol of the IAEA?
I think there's a particular protocol, but please continue.
So they joined this multilateral treaty that lays out a framework for liability, and then they announced guidance that its nuclear law, domestic nuclear legislation, was in conformance with that law. And then the third thing they did was they set up a domestic insurance pool for operators and vendors for liability from nuclear accidents. And so those 3 steps are designed to increase confidence in the domestic and foreign companies in the nuclear industry. All I can say is that Westinghouse found them sufficient.
Westinghouse, now if they could just move their jobs back to the United States, I'd be more happy with them. I'll yield back.
Can I respond briefly?
I didn't even mention global warming. We talked about the Maldives. No. I didn't mention the ex-Maldive Islands.
I said tax reform.
The $10 billion in U.S. content and export content in the nuclear deal, potential in the nuclear deal, we believe would generate 50,000 jobs.
15,000?
Yeah.
No, I want to build on that. When we look at what China's done with the One Belt, One Road, there's over $1 trillion invested roughly that they've invested through loans from other countries, and they have such a strong presence. Do you feel the business model that we're working with our foreign aid, as small as it is, but more importantly, with the relationships we're developing with like-minded democracies, is enough to offset that in our mill-to-mill cooperation with India and with Sri Lanka? What are your thoughts on that? Is that enough to fend off the encroachment of China with their investments?
I mean, our priority has been to increase intra-regional connectivity.
Right.
And, if you look at the region, their inter-regional trade comprises only 2%, which is the lowest in the world. And a lot of what we bring to the table is the soft assistance, helping with regulations and frameworks, and how do you do customs, and how do you streamline procedures. And that assistance has proved, I think, very useful for countries like Bangladesh and India, where in my written remarks I note it takes 20 permits to export something from one side of the border to the other. And so how do we break down those barriers? How do we use MCC to promote, electricity trade between Nepal and India?
Right, with the hydroelectric
Exactly,
investment.
And also the road maintenance component of it. So you actually have the infrastructure that can support the trucks, that can support the trade. And so, these are very specific sometimes and targeted regulatory reforms. Other times they're major investments in infrastructure. But I think we're seen as an extremely credible and valuable partner in this effort.
Ms. Steele, can you add to that?
Yes, I think that what we're doing in all of Asia, I would say, is trying to level the playing field for American companies to be able to come in. In many of the countries in which we work with the governments to be able to do public-private partnerships so that they don't have to go into debt, but rather attract investments, leveraging their own funds. And that I have found has also helped to keep more investments from other countries, including China, to come in. It's worked very effectively in East Asia in particular, where we have done that.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to ask something, it could be a little controversial, but a potential challenging in the U.S.-India relationships and partnership is the rise of the Hindu nationalist politics, which detract from India's traditional, inclusive, multi-faith democracy. A less harmonious India raises human rights concerns and endangers our growing partnership. What are the administration's priorities regarding human rights in India?
India provides the highest constitutional protections for religious minorities, and our goal is to work with India and to encourage India to meet the goals that it sets for itself in its own constitution and its laws. There are cases, obviously, of religious as we detail in both the Human Rights Report and the International Religious Freedom Report, of infringements. And there was the tragic murder of a journalist just this week who was often the subject of nationalist criticism. And so these are challenges for any democracy, but India is a democracy, and it's a vibrant democracy. And we have respect for Indian institutions and ability to rise and meet these challenges, and we certainly, in all of our engagements, at senior levels, encourage the Indian government to do so.
Okay, Ms. Steele, any? I'm going to ask you something because Dr. Bear is on his way down, I heard, and so I'm going to ask you something. And this probably doesn't get asked a lot of people in your situation or your position. What is it that you could see from the United States Congress that, if we changed in policies or directions, would help facilitate what you do? I know, appointing people would be a good thing, or getting them through the Senate. And I'll bring it up to, I'll agree with my colleague here that there have been a lot of positions appointed, but they haven't been passed through the Senate. And I know that would be something, and I see you guys both writing down, so this will be good. And I'll let you direct these at Mr. Sherman, no, at both of us. Because so many times we get the information, and I know there's things that you said, man, if they would have asked this, or if there's something that we should have asked that we didn't. I'd like to hear your thoughts if you're comfortable doing that.
And don't hesitate to say that the President's budget requests are completely wrong, and that we should be providing far more money, especially for Ms. Steele.
If you do that, do it in the third person. I'm not saying this, but somebody else told me this.
Yes, I'll add that to the question. Do you know intelligent people who believe that the President's budget requests are completely wrong and that higher amounts should be spent?
I just want to say I'm very honored that the Secretary Tillerson has trusted me as a senior career officer of 28 years experience to lead the Bureau at this time. And I think it's a mark of his faith in the institution that he has done so. And there is a very ambitious and I think very credible and inclusive discussion of reform of the State Department that's underway. It's coming to its conclusion, and I know we all look forward to its results. But I would say that I'm sitting here before you because Secretary Tillerson trusts the colleagues, the career colleagues that he is working with. I interpreted your question a little bit differently on what Congress can do. I mean, what I would encourage, I really encourage congressional visits. Many of these issues are so complicated. To understand the dynamic in Sri Lanka, Lanka to understand India's rise and the complexity of India as a democracy and the challenges that a democratic government in India has to navigate is best seen firsthand. And so in my experience as a Foreign Service officer and as an ambassador, having congressional visits really built the strength and the foundation for a relationship.
I appreciate you saying that because I just got back from a CODEL to South Korea and Taiwan, and we hear the same thing there, congressional delegation visits. The higher up, the better, because it shows that cooperation, that alliance. Ms. Steele, do you want to add to that?
Yes. Especially this time when resources are more limited, we would like to be able to build a more trusting relationship between you and us so that flexibilities, a little bit more flexibilities, will be available to us to be able to use resources, the limited resources that we have.
Maybe we should visit the State Department then.
No, we will come and visit you more often, provide information, because I think that the relationship built on more trust will enable us to be more responsive and agile on the needs of the, vis-a-vis the needs of the countries. And this is particularly important when resources are limited.
It really is, and that trust, builds on the relationships build on that trust. And I think it's so important. And so many times I feel like when people like you come into a hearing, you feel like it's a to get you type, and it's not. Our goal is to make our relationships with the countries and the regions that we represent stronger, and we rely on your information. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Dr. Berra, who I just had the pleasure to be in South Korea and Taiwan. Doc?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is a very timely hearing, obviously, as we think about the U.S. role in the world, the important mission of USAID and the emerging importance and dynamism of South Asia. Let's think about it in a couple ways. And I know we will be having a hearing on Afghanistan, but the interconnected nature between Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan, was highlighted in the President's comments, and I guess it was a week ago, last week. As we look at our continuing mission in Afghanistan, I know USAID has had a role, but the President, and I would actually support the President's statement that the importance of India continuing to have a role in helping build infrastructure, helping build stability, and then the complexity of Pakistan there in terms of harboring some of the groups that are creating instability there. Creates this complication. Pakistan's concern when the more India is involved in Afghanistan, the more Pakistan seems to get concerned as well. And I would just be curious, Ambassador Wells or Ms. Steele, how you would think about that and how, in terms of kind of negotiating, navigating that with the desire of creating that stability in Afghanistan and how it interrelates with India and Pakistan. So.
Well, just as Pakistan has very real and legitimate security interests in Afghanistan, so does India. And we would like to see and appreciate, constructive economic investments, investments in Afghanistan's stability and institutional stability. And so if you look at India, by 2020, they've pledged to spend $3 billion. Some of the projects they've already funded include the Parliament House, an important dam, training in India for experts and agro, experts, and very vital programs that Afghanistan is going to need. And in that instance, I think the more international partners we can bring to bear who do constructive investments, again, in the economic sphere and then the development sphere, we're very supportive of.
Great. So,
I have nothing to add.
Okay. So, as we think about that role, we'll continue to have a presence there, trying to provide training and security. And we've made significant investments in Afghanistan in terms of educating a generation of girls. You are seeing a younger generation that is, now as they enter adulthood, does give Afghanistan this possibility of creating those civil institutions, and we would hate to lose some of that. shifting to some of the projects in India that I've had a focus on in terms of empowering women and girls in India, you know, I do have some real reservations about the proposed budget cuts that would decimate some of these, you know, programs. You know, some of the cuts to UNFPA, and you know, again, I don't think this is a time for the United States to be stepping out of that void, especially as India historically has been a recipient nation. As it's starting to develop, it also is developing into being a donor nation and partnering with us to do some interesting things as we go into third countries, you know, into Africa and so forth. And, you know, I guess, again, whoever it's appropriate to, Ambassador Wells, maybe you want to touch on the importance of maintaining some of those investments that we have in India.
We really see our relationship with India, you know, transitioning as India itself becomes an increasingly important provider of assistance in the region. We're moving away from India as a donor recipient to India as a partner, as you said, in third countries. We've done interesting work in Africa. There are opportunities for us to do joint training in Afghanistan. And so what we've tried to do, and I will defer to Gloria here, is to really prioritize the remaining funding in those areas where we think we can provide the best multiplier effect or assist you know, Indian private sector and government in being able to tackle a problem more creatively and effectively.
Great. Ms. Steele, do you want to?
In following up on the theme of prioritization, in the health situation in India, we have prioritized supporting the health situation in India. It is probably one of the worst problems, and where we can be better partners and where our dollars will make a bigger difference. They have more incidence of TB than any in the world. They have 1/4 of the maternal and child mortality in the world. And so with the limited resources we have prioritized funding in India around health, TB, TB prevention and cure, and maternal and child health.
And obviously, if we could get you more funding, then you could have a bigger impact. So thank you.
Yes.
I'll go back.
Thank you for that. Next, we'll go to Mr. Connolly from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. Great to see you both again. I will say you've got a job to do, and God bless you for trying to do it. But when we talk about South Asia, perhaps it is the most affected region in the world with respect to the retrograde policies of the Trump administration, ripping up TPP, ripping up our participation in the Paris Climate Accord, and, of course, slashing AID's budget, especially in this region. All those things probably have the most effect, the most intense effect in South Asia than anywhere else in the planet. And to that end, you know, here we are correctly debating, and I know my friend, the chairman of this committee, he's going to defend Trump, but I also know that Ted Yoho has really reflected on how important a foreign assistance program is. It's a modest investment. It's a modest part of our diplomatic machinery to keep America great. And I really applaud the chairman of the subcommittee for articulating that position. I know that was not his original position when he first got elected to Congress, but like all of us, we learn. We come to appreciate. And I certainly hope that happens in the administration, because the cuts being proposed, the retreat being proposed, I think is profoundly deleterious to U.S. interests and simply opens the way to another power in Asia that's only too happy to walk through that opening. And that's not making America great again. That's making America weak again. And let me ask you, Ms. Steele, and feel free, Ambassador Wells, to comment. I'm not asking you to comment on what I just said, because that would be impolitic for you, both of you. In fact, I'm going to say, for the record, you both vehemently disagree with everything I just said, defending the Trump administration. But South Asia, we've got the heaviest monsoon rains in 40 years, 1,400 dead, hundreds of thousands of homes damaged or destroyed, 41 million people directly affected, and a third of an entire sovereign nation, Bangladesh, underwater. How well prepared are we to respond to that crisis, Ms. Steele?
We are prepared to respond to the crisis when and if they request for our assistance.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
When they request for our assistance,
You mean
we will be
Bangladesh
there.
has not requested any
No.
assistance?
Not on the flooding. Nepal has, but Bangladesh has not, and they have not right now. But we are poised and prepared to assist when they do.
Could the fact that a third of an entire sovereign nation, Bangladesh, being underwater, could it have anything at all to do with, I don't know, the warming of the climate? All right.
Could I just add another dimension to?
Of course.
In our military-to-military cooperation, we've done extraordinary work in disaster assistance, humanitarian response, including with Bangladesh and with Nepal. In fact, we tragically lost 7 of our own in Nepal in a helicopter accident in the wake of the earthquake response. And so in Bangladesh, where we've built over 500 cyclone shelters, we've worked on how you manage water resources. There's been a significant U.S. investment in that effort and an ongoing commitment to increase the capacity of Bangladeshis to respond.
I appreciate that, Ambassador Wells, but the fact of the matter is the Trump budget slashes health for these 3 countries by 50%. This flooding is now leading to a mass outbreak of diarrheal-related diseases, malaria, dengue fever, and possibly cholera. How can we, in good conscience, cut our health budget to these countries in half in light of what's happening in front of our faces? How can we justify that? How can we make those programs efficacious with a 50% cut?
On humanitarian assistance and disaster response, these are not bilaterally allocated. We have a central fund for humanitarian assistance, and as I mentioned earlier, Mr. Connolly, we are prepared to respond when they request for our assistance. And they have not done so. And I believe, as my colleague Alice said, we have invested in helping them mitigate the impacts of disasters. And we are ready. The budget that you see that's allocated for these countries do not reflect the humanitarian assistance budget that we have centrally.
Mr. Chairman, would you allow me just one follow-up question with respect to Bangladesh? I thank the chair. Why hasn't Bangladesh asked for our help? I'm puzzled by that. I mean, maybe the phone is underwater with the rest of the country.
I do not know the response to your question, and I will follow up and ask.
Ambassador Wells, do you have any idea?
Received.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry, I don't want to, I'm running out of time, so I didn't mean to be abrupt. All right, well, if anyone's listening, Bangladesh, please call. Got a phone number? No, all right. State Department. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Dr. Barra would like to have another shot at some questions, if you guys are okay.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to make a statement. Listening to my colleague, Mr. Connolly, as well as having being a classmate of Chairman Yoho, and serving on foreign affairs with Mr. Sherman. This is an incredibly important time for the United States with everything going on around the world in South Asia to continue to stay engaged and involved. And both Ambassador Wells and Ms. Steele, you guys are doing the best you can within the circumstances and the resources that are being provided. And I think it's important to make a statement about the public servants who serve us within the State Department and represent our country around the world. Again, I just want to make a statement on how much, as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee and a member of Congress, we appreciate their service. We understand they're doing what they can, and I think it's important for us to let them hear how much we as members of Congress, as well as the public and the citizens of the United States, appreciate that service and representation. So thank you.
If the gentleman will yield, I so appreciate the individuals who work at the State Department. I married one of them.
Well said on both counts with both of you, because I was going to end that way. Ambassador Wells, Ms. Steele, as you go forward, as our State Department goes forward in these economic times that we're having in our country, and as we're having some challenges here, we may be cutting some programs, but we're going to replace it with the goodwill, as you said, the humanitarian assistance. You are the spokesmen for the United States government as you go to these countries, and we rely on you to instill into those countries the belief that we are here with them. We will stand with them. We will work through our challenges, but we are there to provide that assistance. So I do appreciate it. This committee, I think, speaks as a voice of unity in saying that same thing. And again, I can't tell you how much we appreciate you coming in, being upfront, and just very engaging. Thank you both. This meeting is adjourned.